most people here have cubicles because it wasn't arranged.
All right. Shall we begin? Yeah. Good morning, all, and thank you for braving the bad weather to be here today, and greetings to those of you online as well. The topic of U.S. investment in China has attracted greater attention over the past decade as Beijing's ambitions to dominate technologies and rival the United States have come into sharper focus. Our U.S. companies, as Representative Mike Gallagher is fond of saying, funding our own destruction. Should there be limits on and regulation of American businesses' conduct in China? How Washington should approach this issue has challenged some long-held assumptions and practices of U.S. policy and statecraft. To go through these issues today help us go through these issues today are four very accomplished scholars and practitioners. The course of events today will have presentations from each of them from 10 minutes, and then we'll move to Q&A. With us this morning, starting from far down the line and moving closer to me, is Bryan Burack. He's a senior policy advisor for China and the Indo-Pacific and the Indo-Pacific at the Heritage Foundation. Bryan has extensive experience on Capitol Hill. He served on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, where he was a professional staff member and counsel, and a lead advisor to Congressman, now Chairman, Michael McCaul. Next to him is Ivan Kanapathy. Ivan is a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's a senior vice president at Beacon Global Strategies and an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. Ivan was a career military officer. He served as a military attaché to the American Institute in Taiwan, and he was on the National Security Council as senior deputy director for Asia and director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia. Next to him is Derek Scissors. Derek is a senior fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute, and the reason we're all gathering here today. Derek's also a senior economist at China Beige Book, and he's the author of the China Global Investment Tracker. And if you don't know those, they're very, very useful. China Beige Book does an incredible job in tracking the state of the Chinese domestic economy, and the China Global Investment Tracker is a very good record of how China is building connectivity and infrastructure throughout the world. And then,
Get your money later.
and then finally, Christopher Ford is a professor of international relations and strategic studies at Missouri State University. He has many accolades and titles. To name a few, he's a visiting fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution. He was a MITRE fellow at the MITRE Corporation and also served as Assistant Secretary of State for International Security and Arms Proliferation. And with that, we'll begin with the first of our presentations. Derek, you're going to go first.
Thanks, Charles. Cards on the table. I am hoping, and I think some other people are hoping, I know some other people are hoping, that the issue of outbound investment is brought up in the House of Representatives in the next few months. It's certainly being discussed. So this event is in large part motivated by trying to raise the profile and inform people concerning this issue. Obviously, it has to get through the House or move in the House before it gets to the Senate. So it's a long way to go for anything to happen. But that's the motive. This is a live policy issue, and we're going to treat it as such, and people here are going to talk about it that way. So that's giving me credit. Now I'm going to take away that credit by saying, I want to talk about data, which is boring, and boring for all the people watching who I'm trying to influence on policy and all that stuff. I'll try to make it interesting. It's really hard to make good policy decisions with poor quality data. You can get them right, but a lot of times you don't. And this is a data-rich area, or it should be. It's not an area of stories. It's not about one company, but a lot of companies, a lot of decisions. What do we do about it? And the punchline here, which is quite controversial, but it's also factually supported, is we've already screwed up on outbound investment in a really big way. I'm going to now document that and then try to start to propose solutions, which my colleagues will do a lot more with. And when I say we've already screwed up in a really big way, of course I don't mean me. I mean particularly Donald Trump and Steve Mnuchin. And I'm going to try to establish that. The level of U.S. investment in mainland Chinese stocks and bonds, which is known as securities investment or portfolio investment, so we're talking about stocks and bonds, at the end of 2016, it was $370 billion. At the end of 2020, it was $1.15 trillion. It more than tripled. It rose by $780 billion during Trump's 4 years. He justifiably attacked U.S. money leaving the country for China when he ran in 2015, 2016. He was right. And then under his presidency, U.S. money poured out of the country into China. When they talk about Trump, when people talk about Trump being tough on China, when they talk about a trade war, all of that is undermined by this fact. Whatever you think the impact of the trade war, and I don't even think there was one, but whatever you think the impact was, it's completely dwarfed by the flood of U.S. money going into China. U.S. investment in Chinese securities by itself made the U.S. economy more closely linked to China in 2020 than it was in 2016. So you're going to hear endless talk about Trump's going to do this and the trade war, and where the money says we got closer to China in the Trump administration, and any sort of trade war was completely outmatched by investment love. In 2020 alone, I'm going to stop belaboring this point and turn to data, but I do want to make it. In 2020 alone, COVID is killing hundreds of thousands of Americans and costing trillions of dollars, and at best, China is lying through its teeth about it, and it still is. The value of U.S. portfolio investment in China rose $300 billion. That's what we did to respond to COVID. So that's why I think we've really screwed up. Okay, now I'm going to talk about the data issue, which is the best defense that President Trump has is ignorance. And the reason is that every month Treasury still puts out false data on outbound investment. If you look up Treasury data, you're going to find a result that says the Cayman Islands have received $2.5 trillion in U.S. investment in stocks and bonds. They don't have stock or bond markets. The actual number is zero, or $3. It's transactionally close to zero. They're a transit point for money going elsewhere, including money coming back to the United States. But we don't report that. Over the course of 2019, it became clear to me over the course of 2019, there were some other people who knew it beforehand, that a large amount of the money that was said to be going to the Caymans was not going to the US, it wasn't going to Japan, it wasn't going to the United Kingdom, it wasn't going to one of our friends, it was going to China. And in September 2019, the Federal Reserve published the first version of a paper that corrects the false data that Treasury publishes every single month. Still publishes it. And we know what's going on to some extent thanks to the updates of this paper. Those numbers I gave you before come from the Federal Reserve. We have a long regime of controlling tech exports. Don't send technology overseas that people will use to start wars or to win wars that are our enemies or brutal dictatorships. We have an oversight body that prevents risky countries from buying technology when they invest in the US. That's the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. It was reformed by Congress in 2018, mostly due to concerns about Chinese money. But American money goes to China with no oversight. You can't sell technology to China in form of exports. China cannot buy technology in the United States without a review. But send money to China, we have no idea what you're doing. And we don't care. That's what we've said so far. I'm talking about portfolio and securities investment because that's where the action is. Direct investment, which is buying a 10% or larger stake in a Chinese company or setting up a new project, a greenfield project, is more valuable dollar for dollar, but it's been stable. And direct investment, has breakdowns for sectors, manufacturing, other sectors. Portfolio investment has nothing. Whatever you think the total for portfolio investment is, given by the Fed, or if you want, given by Treasury, if you want to know how much is going into advanced technology, no idea. We don't even try to gather that information. The stock of U.S. portfolio investment fell in 2021 and 2022. according to the Federal Reserve. Again, Treasury doesn't tell us that. U.S. portfolio investment in China, I apologize. Stock of U.S. portfolio investment in China fell the last 2 years that we have on record. It's not because the Biden administration did anything. It didn't do anything. It still hasn't done anything, and my colleagues will talk about that more. It fell because it was a bad investment. Those were foolish investments, and new money was discouraged. But we don't know what happened in 2023. China didn't do well economically, but China incentivizes investments in key sectors. So the property sector is tanking. There's weak consumption. That's fine. The Chinese will subsidize what it sees as key sectors, and those priorities become more profitable because of the subsidies. Hey, I have a guarantee of never losing money or going out of business because the Chinese government's supporting me. Sounds like a pretty good investment if that's all you care about is or at least not losing money. Chinese priorities include synthetic biology, artificial intelligence, semiconductors. That's what they're subsidizing. We have no idea what the amount of U.S. money is going to support those sectors. We're waiting on an EO, which I think Ivan's going to talk about at some length. I'll just give you a quick summary. In my opinion, it's weak. It's not in effect. It hasn't been implemented yet. And Secretary Yellen has been pro-China for many years. If that's controversial, I'm happy to take questions on it. There's overwhelming evidence that U.S. investors want to find what's profitable in China, which is not property, it's not consumer stocks, but it could be AI, and Treasury will go along with that. And my part of the solution, which is just the start, but you got to have good data to make good policy, is we need bi-sector disclosures. We need to know not just that the Federal Reserve corrects bad Treasury data once a year. We need to know where the money is going. The total amount of money has dropped. Has the amount of money in synthetic biology dropped? Are we sending more money to China to support their semiconductor industry? No idea. That's a pretty basic policy mistake. Now, what sectors do we know about? Anything Congress thinks is critical. Whether to restrict investment is an important, reasonable debate. But anyone who says, I don't like transparency, you know right away they're a bad actor. You can't oppose transparency and say you're for free markets. There are people running around saying, I don't want investment restrictions because I believe in free markets. Like the Chinese don't believe in free markets, which is a big problem with that argument. But you can't then say, but don't tell anyone what we're doing. So finally, I'm just going to summarize with Wall Street is going to want to go back to China if it's not still there already in sectors that are dangerous to the United States. It will. We saw that because in 2017, even in 2020, during COVID, American money flooded into China. It's up to Congress to keep us from funding technology that could one day kill Americans. And the first step in doing that is knowing what's actually happening.
Great. Thank you very much, Derek. Now we'll go to Ivan Kanapathy, who is going to lay out. Oh, sorry, I got the order wrong. We're going to go to Chris first.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you. A couple of caveats up front. First of all, of course, these are only my own personal views. They don't necessarily reflect those of anybody else. And secondly, I am not knowledgeable about the world of investment and finance. Those are the caveats. The point, however, is that I do know at least a little something about strategy and about Chinese foreign relations. And so what I hope to do is to be able to offer a framing construct for thinking about this problem and why I think it's a significant, important question, and why I agree with Derek and his concern about the more than tripling of U.S. investment in China since the beginning of the Trump administration, and why I am very concerned about its opacity. So we in the United States often tend to assume that countries undertake economic relationships for economic reasons. I mean, that's, I think, sort of a naive mirror imaging, if you will, but we do tend to assume that. And what we often miss in dealing with the PRC is the degree to which China has a very deliberate strategic aspect to its economic, its trading, and its investment relationships. It's always looking for ways to leverage and even to weaponize trading and investment relationships for strategic and for political gain, and even undertakes them sometimes when they are decidedly uneconomical, precisely in order to entangle others in relationships of dependency that the Chinese Communist Party can thereafter exploit. Now, if you listen to Xi Jinping talk, you would think that China bestows its economic relationships on other countries as a kind of imperial, munificence, if you will. This is the benevolent act of the Son of Heaven in the ancient conceit, right? A public good for the world. They actually use that phrasing increasingly these days. Now, the reality of such relationships is very different, and that's that they tend to be profoundly asymmetrical, creating vast hub and spoke networks of bilateral dependencies upon China. And I think that asymmetry is precisely the point. As I've tried to point out repeatedly, it is part of the PRC's strategy to minimize China's dependence upon foreign trade and investment and economic relationships while maximizing the rest of the world's dependence upon China. And I don't know, I'm not enough of an economist to know how successful some of these things are likely to be, but at the very least I can assure you that things like the Belt and Road Initiative, things like the dual circulation concept, all of these sorts of things, whether or not they have any economic rationality or are successful in those terms, Beijing will work tirelessly to ensure that those relationships are always managed to China's advantage, to create what I term leverage webs that Beijing is thereafter able to exploit. Now, if you've been paying attention, you've probably seen a lot of these leverage webs in the world around you, right? China is not at all shy about penalizing and cutting off foreign companies, celebrities, law firms, even entire countries, basically anybody who does or says something that the CCP finds sufficiently distasteful. And this is how the CCP has been trying, in effect, by degrees, to export its domestic system of social control by dribs and drabs to the rest of the world. And this is the context that I would urge that we keep in mind in thinking about issues like outbound investment, because this is how China undertakes basically all of its overseas economic relationships, including with the United States and including investment relationships. It's not a new phenomenon, to be sure, right? It's long been possible for Chinese officials to look to those in the United States and international business communities who are enamored of making money in Chinese markets and look to them to help push back against policies that China finds that it doesn't like. That's not a new thing precisely, right? You may remember, you all are probably too young to remember, but I remember how after President Clinton first took office, there was a concerted campaign that was begun to convince him to abandon his campaign promises, to link China's most favored nation trading status to progress on human rights observation. Now, as the sinologist John Garver has recounted this, the most important of the tactics adopted by China was, quote, the mobilization of the US business community. Chinese representatives visiting the United States spread the message that China's loss of MFN status, that's most favored nation status, would injure US businesses, and China's tactics were successful. A large part of the US business community mobilized to lobby against Clinton's linkage policy, and by early 1994, it was clear that Clinton would not be able to follow through on his threat, even though China had not delivered significant overall progress on human rights. Now, that's just one example, but it's an early one, and one that's particularly striking so soon after the massacre of workers and students on Tiananmen Square in June of 1989. Those of us who've been around this town for a while may remember others, right? My own experience sort of working as a Hill staffer starts around about the time that US defense contractors were actually helping China improve its international ballistic missiles by assisting it with a Long March rocket booster. Because American companies wanted to take advantage of cheap satellite launch services, which kept blowing up on the launch pad for a while in the 1990s. So they had to help tinker with the missiles, the satellite launch boosters, to help make them work better and save American investors money. And this goes all the way to the present day, right, with the reported 10 standing ovations that American business leaders reportedly gave to Xi Jinping at that gala banquet last November in San Francisco. So with apologies to Charles Wilson, who is remembered, I think wrongly, but remembered back in 1953 as having said, what's good for General Motors is good for America, it's most emphatically not the case that whatever is profitable for US business interests in dealing with China is actually good for the United States. Some engagements with China, however profitable they might be for those involved, are terrible ideas for the United States, playing into Beijing's strategy, both by making the CCP stronger and by giving it more ways to manipulate us and manipulate others. And this is the context to keep in mind in talking about things like outbound investment screening. From a purely economic point of view, I would suspect there are already powerful reasons for U.S. finance to be very wary of investments in China. They don't seem to see this themselves, as the data that we were talking about recounts. But this there ought to be reason for concern, I would think, because if you have any significant investment in China, you can't be confident that you'll ever be permitted to get it out if you want to. The CCP is very concerned about capital flight. It seems to scrutinize such flows with increasingly careful eyes. And it is both very skittish about anything that would suggest any sign of lack of confidence in the Chinese economy, and it's entirely willing to impose economic penalties on any foreign entity that does or says anything that displeases it. And this combination means, as a practical matter, that investments in China are easily transformed into tools of leverage for political reasons, not economic reasons. If you remember, not too long ago, how China gratuitously seized 2 innocent Canadian hostages on cooked-up spying charges after Canada arrested Wang Wenzhou, the Huawei executive, after a U.S. criminal indictment and extradition request, and how they held these 2 Canadians for, I think, over 1,000 days, until mysteriously letting these dangerous spies go free the moment that Mrs. Wang was let go by the Canadian authorities, right? So I can assure you, if China can do this with real-life human being foreign citizens, it can certainly do this with your money. So there ought to be reasons for investors in China to be concerned in the first place. But even if that's not the case, it ought to be of concern to U.S. policymakers, because these dynamics mean that if you're an investor with big sums of money invested in China, it's the CCP rather than you that gets to decide and gets to have the last word on when or whether you can get that money back out. And this gives you powerful reasons to do what the party wants, or at least not to do things that it doesn't like. This makes you a node in China's leverage web. And this is something that U.S. policy leaders, I think, need to consider, especially given the role that U.S. business leaders have spent over the years in effect, lobbying for the PRC out of concern for Chinese market profits. Now, unless we understand some means of understanding where American money goes in China, assessing its impact, and at least potentially having some ability to intervene if money is going into things that are of profound national security or strategic risk to us. Unless we have some mechanism to do that, which, as we've just heard, we don't, I think we are missing a very, very important strategic phenomenon, and frankly, shame on us. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Now we'll get to Ivan, please.
Thanks so much, Charles, and thanks, Derek, for having us. Great setting the stage here for us, and I'll take you back from like an inside, I guess, policymaker at the time point of view. I was in the Trump White House for the last 3 years, working on Asia, China, Taiwan policy in particular. And while I obviously agree, or a lot of folks agree with Derek's sentiments, right, that we shouldn't, that these investment flows, the flows of capital, really didn't stop. I think realistically, if we take ourselves back to 2018, I showed up there, I think the same week the 301 report came out, right? There was quite a bit of vitriol, and to say the least, right, being directed at the White House, at the administration. And so just given what you could realistically accomplish, I think, in my view anyway, I think the Trump administration took us huge strides in the right direction. So for what that's worth, that started with trade, right? I mean, it's like American born and bred and educated into us, including me when I went to graduate school, that the free flow of goods and services around the world, but in particular between the United States and China, was good and shouldn't be touched, right? And even more so, the free flow of capital. And so we went after the goods and services, as we all know, and it's been well documented, starting in 2018. And it took a little while longer. We took some very small steps, I think, at the very end of the Trump administration, looking at some of the issues with capital flows. I was talking to Charles earlier. He was at the Journal 5 years ago, so February of 2019, there was an article about the indexer, MSCI. I'm sure some of you know of MSCI. They sort of list these huge indexes, right? They kind of combine different equities and listings together and say, okay, here's a group of emerging markets funds. Here's a group of European stocks, that creates a fund. And a lot of institutional investors tend to follow, they're one of the major indices that is followed. And what the story of the Wall Street Journal had told us was that, well, MSCI sort of had a conflict of interest in China because, for the reasons that Derek and Chris talked about, MSCI had been pressured by the Chinese government to include more Chinese stocks into indexes, in emerging market indexes in particular. In fact, they were getting ready to quadruple, I think, from like 2% to 8% in some of the more widely used indexes. And the reason was because MSCI, the conflict was looking to provide more financial services in the Chinese market. And so, the question then obviously becomes for the investors that are following these indexes, are you actually getting, the investment, the financial service companies that then recommend these indices, are you actually doing your fiduciary responsibility? Are you actually looking out for the investors' returns? And we had some concerns, obviously, it became quite clear that may not be happening because of the way Wall Street's set up with these conflicts as they try to break into the China market to provide financial services. That led to the White House basically intervening through the Secretary of Labor in what's known as the Thrift Savings Plan, which is the huge federal government employee 401k. Took a lot of flack for that too, basically being say, don't inject politics, right, into what should be investment decisions, again, based on getting the best returns, when in fact, it was the opposite. What we were trying to do was say, no, China's the one, trying to influence these things, and we just need you to hold for a second and not. They had a plan where they were about to start adding, shifting indexes based on MSCI, and add a bunch of Chinese stocks. And some of these stocks were on the entity list for working with the PLA, right, and other things, human rights abuses, contributing to those, et cetera. So there were some pretty major concerns, and that led to, the thrift board anyway, after 3 years later, and this actually just happened a couple months ago, they finally decided, okay, we're not gonna add the Chinese stocks, but we had to pause it back then in 2020 because it was about to happen. That was, I would tell you, the first thing that I know of, sort of like executive branch saying outbound investment restrictions. And it's small, it's tiny, because it's just federal retirement. So then we look at the whole country. Well, there's tons of institutional investments, right? Endowments, college, university endowments, other retirement funds. Obviously, federal workers aren't nearly all the workers in the United States. So, and that was the genesis of an executive order right at the end of the Trump administration, Executive Order 13959. Some of you may know about it, but it basically evolved into what is now called Treasury's non-SDN, so non-full blocking sanctions, so something less than that, but non-SDN CMIC list, which is the Chinese military industrial complex. That's what it eventually turned into. DOD initially had sort of the lead on deciding who would be on that list. That was shifted to Treasury because of some due diligence problems over at DOD, frankly. But now we're stuck with this list that Treasury hasn't updated since 2021, and frankly, they tend to not want to. It's sort of not in their interest based on their constituency, based on, which a lot of Wall Street folks, right? And so they're not going to lean into it the way that originally was intended to have DOD take the lead. And that's kind of as far as we've gotten, like Derek mentioned, on the executive side, and there's this EO that has not been implemented. So what's going on now, fast forward 3 years, the Biden administration's, after much debate, right, has issued this EO in August of 2023. And the EO basically, it has, I think it does actually a decent job. It's a proposal, so nothing's set. There's going to be a rulemaking process. I think in all likelihood, it'll get softened even beyond, what Derek obviously judges is already pretty weak. It does a decent job on semiconductors, kind of matches our export controls. But when you talk about quantum sensing, and so quantum and AI are the other two sectors it hits other than semiconductors. So quantum sensing and AI kind of proposes to have a clause of exclusive or even primary military use, which is a little bit of a problem when you talk about some of the examples that have been unearthed by folks, at think tanks, where we now have emerging technologies that are potentially dual use, but in the initial concept, when they're being funded through venture capital, for example, they're not intended for military use. Or, cynically put, a founder could just say, this is not for military use, and therefore would not be covered under this executive order. And then later, at a later stage of development, obviously with China and its missile fusion strategy, that technology would then clearly, if applicable, be absorbed into use for the military, human rights abuses, and things like that. So definitely some loopholes in that executive order, but again, if it's a start, if we can get somewhere, probably better than nothing. And the last thing I'll touch on before I hand over to Bryan, who will have more on it, is a couple of the efforts on the Hill then to kind of address this. And I think the ball, sort of maybe the hot potato, has kind of bounced back and forth between the executive and congressional branches for a while. Last year in the Senate, they passed the Cornyn-Casey bill, the Outbound Investment Transparency Act, which I think actually gets at some of the things Derek was talking about, which is we need to know more. And it would do that, and it focuses on a range of sectors, including the three I mentioned, plus hypersonics and a couple others. And that might actually be useful, but that kind of get put on the shelf, right? While the House this year, toward the end of last year and this year, sort of debating, I think, between a couple of bills. One, I think some of you know that Representative Barr has put forth, which is to take or ask Treasury to basically expand on this NSCMIC list that I mentioned, to ask Treasury every year to now look at Commerce's entity list, so other lists that kind of call out bad actor entities in China, right? Commerce's list, DoD's list, which they now have their own list that doesn't impact investment, but ask Treasury to look at all these and then decide yes or no, I'm going to apply sanctions. And in this case, I think the proposal is full financial property blocking sanctions. My concern with that bill, obviously, is that the Treasury Department is generally reticent and unlikely to employ an authority like that. They tend to, sometimes for good reasons, be much more conservative in that application. And then the other bill, finally, is one from Chairman McCall, and I think it's McCall Meeks. And it really helps, and it's bipartisan, right? And it kind of really undergirds the authorities that the Biden administration is looking for the EO. The authorities exist, they come from IEPA. A lot of you are familiar with IEPA. That's what the current NSCMIC list is based on. But bottom line, I feel like the McCall-Meeks bill, it doesn't actually compel the executive to do anything. So if our concern is the executive isn't going to do enough, then I think the proposals in the House don't go far enough. So some combination thereof, like we have in the Senate, that kind of forces transparency might also be applicable. But let me pause there. That's a quick and dirty and unfortunately probably too detailed summary, but let Bryan pick up.
Yeah, happy to. Thanks for having me. Thanks, Charles. Thank you, Derek. When it comes to the operating environment on Capitol Hill, I just wanted to make 3 observations that might be useful for the group. The first is that outbound investment restrictions for China have become a major political and policy liability for House leadership. The current speaker inherited this shortly after he assumed the speakership. And as Dr. Scissors mentioned, the outcome is really going to be decisive in the House. This isn't a new issue for Congress. Congress has addressed some form of restrictions or transparency for outbound investment for a number of years. It was part of the debate over FIRMA in 2018. A version of it passed in 2021 in the House, and obviously the Senate spoke overwhelmingly in favor of transparency for outbound investments into China just last year. Each of these things was defeated procedurally. And in fact, both chambers has actually voted in favor of either outbound investment transparency or restrictions in some form independently. Obviously, this year's defense bill debate was the Speaker's first major national security exercise and it came shortly after President Biden's executive order, which some of the panelists have discussed. When the Outbound Investment Transparency Act, which is the most recent incarnation of transparency restrictions, was stripped out of the defense bill this year, the Speaker found himself essentially immediately outflanked by the White House, who had taken action on this issue. So what we have now in the House of Representatives is essentially a debate between two factions. The first centers around the Republican members of the House Financial Services Committee, who continue to, generally speaking, advocate a sanctions-only approach, which Ivan alluded to, and they're hostile towards transparency requirements and sectoral investment prohibitions. On the other side, we have this emerging bipartisan coalition. Generally speaking, the Senate has spoken in favor of transparency requirements on a bipartisan basis, and we see a bipartisan coalition in the House of Representatives that's open to transparency and prohibition as well. So that was the sort of state of play as we exited 2023. Coming into 2024, after efforts to do something about this issue ultimately fell on their face in the defense bill process, the Speaker set up a working group of some kind with a few select members on both sides of this debate to try to forge a compromise. That brings us to the second point I wanted to touch on, which is that I think that a fair assessment of the political and policy reality seems to indicate that the side arguing for transparency requirements and sectoral investment prohibitions has the upper hand in the debate. Politically, it's just increasingly untenable for members of Congress to argue against transparency for investments in Chinese military technology. Both chambers have already voted for some form of action in this respect, and it's increasingly clear that the lack of an outbound investment regime is increasingly undermining our export control tools. And at the end of the day, the president's executive order is going to start to do something on this issue eventually, and blocking the executive order, which in fact certain Republican members of Congress have also tried to do, would be politically disastrous if it actually was enacted. On policy grounds, it's a similar sort of debate. The facts support transparency and sectoral prohibitions, and we've seen the group who is advocating a sanctions-only approach make a number of arguments that are really just counterfactual based on what we know about Xi Jinping's China today. I think most surprisingly for me, part of this argument has been predicated on regurgitating debunked ideas about China policy from 20 or 30 years ago that unrestricted and opaque investment into China will, quote, pry open China's economy and cause the CCP to liberalize its practices and cause Chinese companies to adopt the rule of law. I think it's not controversial to say that that's been disproven over the last several decades. This group has sought to deny the basic premise that United States capital investments have helped China develop military technology at all, despite the fact that we have documented examples of this occurring, like with regards to SMIC, the PRC semiconductor foundry champion, and numerous other examples which were just documented this past week by the China Select Committee in their latest report. There's been cited a lack of data to support outbound investment restrictions, while the same folks citing that argument are also opposed to generating transparency requirements that would produce such data. We're seeing the continued push of a sanctions-only approach, even though sanctions are inherently backwards looking. And I think the objective that has been articulated for most of these tools is that they're out to stop potentially problematic PRC military entities from developing technology to begin with, not to punish them after they've done so. And finally, there's a strong argument being made that sanctions are a proven solution, even though for a number of the reasons that Ivan mentioned and others, it's actually proven that sanctions don't help in this context and that Treasury is unlikely to implement them at all. We've seen specific examples of this, such as with regards to Hikvision, which is almost certainly, by any objective analysis, warrant full blocking sanctions pursuant to the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Act. The Treasury has declined to implement several laws, actually, that would apply those. So that's even before we get to the fact that the current sanctions-only proposals on the table have layers of discretion and waivers baked into them. So the third thing that I wanted to mention is, okay, if this is the state of play, what should we look for in the next several months or the next about half of the year? Ultimately, House leadership is going to have to make a decision about this year. And the working group that has been established, we're really seeing both sides double down rather than actually make steps towards a compromise, at least based on what's publicly available. In late November, as was mentioned, the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House advanced a bipartisan proposal that's friendly towards transparency and prohibition. But 2 weeks ago, the Financial Services Committee, also in the House, repeated a hearing that had already occurred, essentially doubling down on a push behind a sanctions-only approach. As this is going on, the new defense bill process is already spinning up, and both chambers have bipartisan bills with a sectoral investment regime sort of ready to go that will likely almost certainly be offered as amendments to the defense bill. So if the compromise between the two factions isn't reached, the Speaker is going to find himself in the exact same position he found himself in November and December of last year, wherein he's going to have to choose whether to allow a small group of his membership to kill something that's broadly supported really by at least 3/4 of the Congress. Despite that, the landing zone for a compromise is pretty small. As far as we're aware, the members that have historically been opposed to a sectoral approach and are still empowered in the process are still a hard no. The problem is that even if you were to take the financial services sanctions-only approach and merge it in some form with a sectoral approach, assuming that there was a compromise possible there, the existing sanctions bill in the House of Representatives is partisan and likely won't pass the Senate. So combining the efforts together would likely be a bit more complicated than just stapling the two bills together and trying to make everybody happy that way. So ultimately, I think it's increasingly clear that we're going to have to see a situation where leadership will have to be exercised, and House leadership in particular will have to step in or continue to let the White House dictate the entire response to this issue heading to the election. Thank you.
Thanks very much to each of you for such a detailed and broad, both detailed and broad presentations on the issue. We're going to turn to Q&A in a moment, but first I'd like to take advantage of my privilege of being up here to ask a few questions and hope that you all will engage in some discussion and maybe even a little debate about the topic. My questions are quite broad in general, and one of them is sort of a Rip Van Winkle question. For those of you who know me, I spent about 25 years in China as a reporter, and I moved back in 2019, and of course I'd read a lot of media reports about changes in the United States, but only since moving back did I begin to appreciate the depths of them. And so my Rip Van Winkle moment is, shouldn't the decision of where, how, and what to invest be left to businesses to decide? Lenin, of course, had that oft-quoted line that capitalists will sell the rope to hang themselves with, and that didn't really happen with the Soviet Union. But is China different, and how? And why shouldn't business be allowed to make these decisions for themselves? Yeah.
Just to start off, one obvious difference with the Soviet Union is that, I suppose thankfully during the Cold War, but the Soviets never had the cornucopia of market and investment opportunities available for profit making that the Chinese are able to offer to international business leaders today. So the opportunities for co-option and taking advantage of the leverage that I was talking about earlier were much reduced. They weren't nothing, and you did see, was it Occidental Petroleum's Armand Hammer was always a notorious, hey, we should get along better with the Soviets, shouldn't we loosen ties? So it's always been the case that there have been, I don't know whether it was, I think that quote from Lenin about selling the rope probably is apocryphal, but I do believe he's well known for the useful idiots phrase, which is perhaps another way to think about some of these challenges. So I would say there's a very big distinction there. And in the sense of having that bait to lure co-optees, China is unfortunately far better equipped than the decrepit, technologically backward Soviet Union ever was.
And my version of this is we don't let businesses do things all the time because we consider them to be illegal, right? We prohibit businesses from investing in all sorts of things, criminal activities. You might say, well, business in China isn't criminal activity. I'm like, well, actually, a lot of it is. Arguably, the biggest Chinese economic attack, and it has security implications on the United States, is theft and coercion of intellectual property. We not only have never punished a Chinese company, we punish individuals. We have never publicly punished a Chinese company for receiving stolen intellectual property. They, of course, become more attractive investment options. Hey, this used to be an American market leader, but I stole all their intellectual property at no cost to me. I am now really, really great profit opportunity. And we just say, okay, go ahead, invest. There are lots of U.S. laws that we don't enforce. Somebody mentioned that, I think it was Ivan, that we are allowed to invest in firms on the entity list. We're allowed to invest in firms that we have a lot of sanctions against. So it's firms that have broken U.S. sanctions with regard to dealings with other countries such as Iran and North Korea. So what I really want to do is take sectors that we think are critical and ban investment in those sectors, not 20 to start with, 4. We haven't been able to do that. It is no good to act like there are good firms and bad firms in China. Xi Jinping doesn't allow there to be good firms and bad firms in China. There might be entrepreneurs in China who would like to obey American law. That decision is not up to them. So a firm-based approach doesn't work. But if I can't have a sector-based approach, I would happily settle for enforcing U.S. law, which we have not even begun to do. So one answer to your question is we don't allow businesses to do whatever they want, but somehow on investment in China, we do allow businesses to do whatever they want. And in fact, we don't even ask them what they're doing.
Yeah, Charles, I think, the question is, it's okay to allow businesses to do what they want if all the countries, right, the governments are sort of playing by the same rules. And I think that's been the constant complaint when you have very strong industrial policy happening in China. And it was, almost a decade ago when we all learned, not that they were trying to hide it in any way, but made in China in 2025, right? And if they're announcing that the Chinese Communist Party is announcing that it wants to dominate, the shipping industry, the rail industry, the airplane industry, IT. I mean, these are just, the industries of the future, and they're willing to use the power of the state behind it, then clearly U.S. needs to do something, or frankly, we're going to lose, right? And that means to use, I think, in some equivalency, and probably in a very different way, but also use the power of the state in order to counter that. If not, I think we're just leaving ourselves open for the long-term sort of loss in the competition. Because the business interests, unfortunately, the truth is they're looking at very much at short-term gains and very, narrowly focused interests.
Ryan, do you
Yeah, just briefly, I think that if we're seeing documented activity that's happening that's manifestly contrary to our national security, it's a natural area for government to step in and start treating China like we treat our other adversaries. I think it was the Journal that reported that United States technology was critical to build China's hypersonic missile that was tested a couple of years ago. It would be even more insane and destructive to help PRC entities develop that kind of technology domestically so that we can't even export control it, which we already don't.
A lot of what has been documented is stolen technology. And Chris, you alluded to some of that, not necessarily stolen, but transferred in terms of the rocket/missile program. On investment, is there a smoking gun? Where has U.S. money gone into helping the Chinese military? The Select Committee report, which I think, Bryan, you referred to on 5 venture capital firms, they were able to corroborate several billions of dollars, I think $3 billion, going into military and police-related companies. It's pretty small considering capital flows in general. So is there evidence that U.S. investment is harming U.S. interests, or is it a concern?
Well, I just want to say this at the beginning. There isn't evidence because we don't want to gather the evidence. I mean, the number one thing I would look for in the evidence is like, oh, well, Chinese investment in, I'll make up a category, U.S. investment in Chinese communications technology has declined. I'm not going to worry about that right now. Maybe it was a problem in the past, but where has it risen? I don't know. Where was it high in 2017? Where was it high in 2022? We don't know, and we don't want to know. That has been Treasury's attitude for a long time. It's the attitude of some people on the Republican side, I would say, more in the House of Representatives. So The first problem is, I mean, there are stories we can tell, and maybe my colleagues have some, but I have stories, but I can't tell you, oh, the primary threat right now is in genetics, because I don't know what the funding levels are. And again, there's a difference between like, well, we're not sure the quality of the data, it's hard to track money to its ultimate location. Okay, if you're trying and failing, that's one thing. We can get better at that over time, but we don't want to try. So my answer to you is the US government doesn't want to know what we're doing that's risky. And if somebody came back and said, look, I mean, we have the stock of investment number, I've explained 98% of it is only being in consumer-facing companies, it's not. But then we'd know, okay, we don't have to worry about this right now. So it's not like data always tells you have to act. But when there has been, and Bryan talked about some of this, deliberate attempts in the short term in the Congress and in the long term by the Department of the Treasury to prevent data gathering, it looks pretty suspicious that something's going on that people don't want revealed.
Charles, there's some, I think there is anecdotal evidence about what like jet engines, right, or gas turbine engines, about, I guess Bryan mentioned hypersonics, but I think there's obvious evidence that we always talk about all the time that you reported about when it comes to the economic threat, right? I mean, what happened to our solar panel industry, our appliance industry, right, our electronics industry, manufacturing specifically. And now the world, and I think the whole, US, European, and probably Japanese business communities are sort of bracing for a tidal wave of overcapacity in semiconductors and electric vehicles. Those industries in China are the result of US, European, and Japanese investment. They would not be there and they would not pose that threat to us if not for investment from us. So, to kind of be like, where's the evidence, to me, seems to miss some of the broader points when it comes to the bigger picture of technology competition in general and our economic security and therefore prosperity.
I just want to riff on that a little bit. I mean, Ivan and I disagree on some things, obviously, but I agree on that. And what people would say is, in response to Ivan, is, well, they would have developed those industries anyway. And that's true. But they would have developed them more slowly. And as a China economist, first and foremost, more slowly has a huge payoff to me. Because the Chinese economy is slowing and it's going to continue to slow. It's going to be less and less of a competitive threat over time due to aging and debt. And I won't go down that rabbit hole, but like you can look that stuff up if you want to see that. So if these industries were 5 years behind schedule, they're still going to happen. China's still going to focus on them. We would be much better off. So it's not an on-off question. It's a sooner or later question, and later is better.
Definitely with you there. And let's be honest, if the argument against getting involved in things like outbound investment screening is that there isn't sufficient evidence that there's a problem, and the people who say that as the excuse to not get involved in investment screening are the same people who are trying to kill efforts to collect the data that would tell us whether or not there's a problem, that's nothing short of scandalous. Let's not beat around that bush. And we also shouldn't pretend that we can place a lot of reliance even upon, I mean, there are even to get the data, there are challenges even with that. But not challenges that mitigate in favor of not doing anything, problems that actually suggest maybe it's even worse than we thought. Even if we got the data about, whatever the financial equivalent is of an end user. I think of this through the National Security Export Controls prism, and obviously there's some very significant differences, but in the technology control world, we used to spend a lot of time. We built our system around getting end user assurances. Well, Derek is a military end user, and Ivan is a civilian end user, so it's okay to export this to Ivan, right? That's the sort of the traditional approach that we've taken in technology controls. We shouldn't expect that we will get a lot of ability to rely upon the ability of investments to contribute only to one sector or another either. If you invest in a particular technology, it can be, it can look and feel and smell entirely sort of civilian and innocuous and so forth, but we forget the context. And I haven't alluded to this. There's this Chinese strategy of military-civil fusion, as it's called. It used to be called military-civil integration, to take a loose transliteration, but the fusion phrasing is more recent, and it coincides with this thing being elevated to a sort of top-level national strategy in the PRC, chaired by this fellow by the name of Xi Jinping, who you might have heard of. And the reason it's a top-level strategy, and the reason that to talk about the equivalent of the word fusion these days is it's no longer about integrating the civilian sector and the defense sector. Integration implies two separate things that are being coordinated and work together in some kind of a fashion. They really aspire to fuse these things so that in a sense there is no longer to the degree that MCF works, military-civil fusion works, there will no longer be a meaningful distinction between the civilian and the security sector. And that makes this actually an even worse problem, even if you do get some data, because in effect, the gains from whatever is invested in are fungible across the entirety of the Chinese economic ecosystem in ways that we have to be very cautious about. It also means that things like the Chinese military-industrial complex list that we talked about a moment ago, or this idea of exclusive or primary military use in the Biden EO. These concepts are actually, in the context of military-civil fusion, these concepts are philosophically unsound. And we have to understand the risks and challenges of any kind of engagement with the Chinese economic ecosystem through this prism. That doesn't mean we should have none, but it means we should be one hell of a lot more cautious than we have been, and we should have as much information as possible about what the challenges are so that we can decide what rational policies are in light of those risks.
Could I just also offer quickly, I don't think that the correct conclusion to draw from the Select Committee report is that the problem is small. That's just what a small staff could find in 6 months with no court orders and no executive branch powers and no legal requirements for the companies to cooperate with them or be transparent about what they're actually doing. So I think it's a small peek behind the curtain. I don't think we should see that as a definitive assessment of what's going on with regards to those 5 entities or any others.
And it's noted in the report, I should say, that what they could document is small compared to the magnitude of the existing problem. Just to follow on with this discussion, American businesses are quite practiced in knowing their customers and have been required to do so with certain kinds of transactions, but that's become almost impossible in China today.
I don't really believe that. I'll say the following thing, and I've had this debate with some of the people that Bryan has been talking about, but since he didn't use names, I guess I won't either, although if I did, it would be Bryan's fault, just to be clear. We should absolutely not be criminalizing corporate mistakes. When somebody says, I thought this is who I was dealing with and it wasn't, you don't criminalize that. You don't punish the company for that. Now, if they do it 4 times in a row, then you start getting the idea that they're doing this on purpose. But one of the things I love about the side that says, the financial community should make all of its own decisions, they know better than you, they know how to handle this, they're experts, you're not expert, is then when they make that point too. But we have no idea what's going on in China. Okay, what? You go back to the people giving you money and say, I have no idea who I'm investing in, but just give it to me anyway? You're the experts on all of this, and people outside of the financial sector shouldn't talk about it, but you can't possibly be expected to know who your counterparty is? Right? So no, I categorically reject that. You will make mistakes, and in fact, the Chinese will try to game investments. Like, oh, look, this is this investment when it's actually something else. And we should not punish people for making mistakes. I mean, oftentimes your investment mistakes are punishment enough, but it isn't the case that you don't know who you're dealing with when you invest large sums of money. You work very hard on knowing who you're dealing with. And that's why these companies don't want any oversight, because it's going to expose that they know exactly who they were giving money to. Not every time, but most of the time.
And even if MCF and things like that make it much harder to do that kind of due diligence, which I'm sure it does, I mean, it has to be understanding, I guess. But that doesn't, that's not an argument for not trying, for goodness sake. There's clearly better and worse ways to do this. And the absolute worst way to do this is just to say, I really don't care, here's more money.
Well, it's also the case that if you're dealing with a Chinese, quote, civilian, unquote, company in advanced technology that has an obvious military application, you can't say, I had no idea. I mean, that's a ridiculous defense. So the reason the people who should be in favor of transparency are not is because the steps down the transparency road make clear that American business has repeatedly helped China in sectors that have harmed the national interest.
Just to continue playing the role of devil's advocate here. Rather than focusing on that we have an insufficient level of regulation or mechanism of regulation, isn't the process sort of working already that we're seeing Granted, we don't have the 2023 data, but it seems that we're seeing investment fall, and we're certainly seeing direct investment in China fall. It's hard to know yet with portfolio investment, but if there was a lot of portfolio investment, they're in for a shock because the Chinese stock market has performed terribly. But we've seen companies like Sequoia, which was one of those that the select committee looked at. They're changing their structure to try to better wall off their investments in China. So isn't the market, aren't business sort of combined with government suasion and just greater acknowledgement of the threat of China and the prospect of more intensive regulation, isn't it already doing the work here and starting to bring investment down?
So I think that there are, in my view, a lot of structural problems with the Chinese economy. And I think finally sort of a lot of investment community is starting to catch on to that. And last year was a huge wake-up call, I think. But I'm not a financial analyst, and there are other folks that may look at this as more cyclical, right? It's probably some combination thereof, for sort of which or which, and that are sort of looking at an opportunity for it to bottom out and when to get in. And I think that just judging from folks that point this out and say, hey, it's already working, so therefore we don't need additional regulation, I sort of question the sincerity of those folks that say that, because really if it's already working and you're not going to keep investing, then why would the regulation really bother you?
Right.
You know what I mean?
And just to add to that, I mean, when this fight started in 2019, 2020, the position of the financial community is you can't do this. This is going to really harm our profits. There's an enormous opportunity here. You can't act when there's a boom. Now there's, you don't need to act because it's a bust. Like when things are really good for us, you can't act. When things are bad for us, you don't need to act. I mean, the answer is obvious. You're never allowed to act. I'll add really quickly. Again, the issue is not, which I agree with what Ivan said, but that's not really the issue. The issue is not structural versus cyclical weakness in the Chinese economy. The issue is subsectors, right? I mean, we don't care about a lot of investment in China. Whether it's going well, whether it's going poorly, the Chinese economy is doing well, it's doing poorly, we don't care. Xi Jinping's goal, the dependence goal, the strategic sectors goal made in China 2025 is not to maximize Chinese growth. That's obvious. There are certain sectors he thinks are crucial. Maybe agriculture is one of them, and we don't really care if the U.S. invests heavily in Chinese agriculture. But there are other sectors where we do care. A lot of them having to do with computing power, and another set having to do with biology. So if aggregate investment is dropping, so the problem in that sense is solving itself, that doesn't mean that the high-risk sectors are dropping.
Well, and they're probably the least likely to become unprofitable from an investor's perspective, precisely because they are the high technology sectors that the CCP targets for massive state infusions of money, precisely because those are the areas they feel most essential to their building up their comprehensive national power for the future. So the areas that are most problematic are the ones for which this don't worry about it, there's a bust argument is the least compelling anyway.
I want to get to audience questions, but I have one more before we do that, and that is, so what does a regulatory mechanism look like here? Is it a reverse CFIUS? Is it a new bureaucracy? I have found it interesting in my short time as a reporter in Washington that the criticisms of CFIUS are that it's really not up to the job for looking at outbound investment, but they also kind of mirror criticisms of Commerce's Bureau of Industry and Security. A lot of fingers are often pointed at Treasury as having the wrong constituency, the wrong perspective for doing this job. So is there a whole institutional revamp that needs to be done to make this happen?
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that a little bit. I think that an analysis of where the majority of national security thinkers on Capitol Hill think this should go basically has two elements, like disclosure and prohibition. Sectors, there have been at least 3 different lists of particular sectors advanced in different bills, but those are really the 2 core elements that that I think the solution must include in order to receive the support of probably the majority of members of Congress who are willing to be reasonable on this issue. I'd also note, just because you mentioned a few different forms of bureaucracy, that the sanctions-only approach, which is pushed by the financial services clique that I mentioned earlier, which is led by Chairman Patrick McHenry, by the way. I think it's obvious who is behind that effort primarily, has also sort of levied a criticism that this would be an excessively bureaucratic exercise. At the same time, their approach would require playing whack-a-mole with companies, which would likely require a far greater bureaucratic infusion to even begin to work. So the 2 pillars, notification, prohibition, I think is kind of where this is all headed.
I mean, I'll add that there's a really simple solution, and it even fits with a lot of congressional intent. We just haven't been able to get there. It fits with what the Biden administration says its policy is. Small yard, high fence, except that it doesn't have a high fence. It has a low fence with a bunch of holes in it. And that's on purpose. It's not an accident that the Treasury notice of proposed rulemaking was asking questions that they knew the answer to years ago, and that we haven't got implementing regulations. They don't want a high fence, and neither do a lot of constituencies in the Republican Party as well. So, there's a simple thing to do here, which is gather information and ban investment in certain sectors. And you have to define the sectors. AI is very broad. So what do you mean by AI where you should have bannable investment? And you'll have to update that every 2 years. Oh no, you have to update your regulations. This is an incredible burden. But that's what should be done. It shouldn't be 30 sectors. It should be a few. And we need to learn from that. The US government does not do large new things well at the beginning. But that doesn't require a lot of bureaucracy. It's incredibly simple. And the reason you don't have this simple solution is because people don't really want a solution. So they try to muck it up instead. But that's the answer. We gather information, we identify what we consider to be the risky sectors, and we ban investment in those sectors. And if 2-4 years later, we change our minds and we unban one sector and ban another, good, that's what should happen.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that, Charles. I think the notification is really critical. And it's, they call it transparency, but it doesn't mean transparency like the whole world knows. It just means the government needs to know, right? And I think that's important too, that you're not putting someone at a business disadvantage, by sort of compelling transparency. But that gathering all that information over the initial year or 2 would then allow us to kind of steer where prohibitions may or may not need to go.
You could make the case that better data and better analytical decision support for policymakers in this arena will actually be in the advantage, or in the interests of the financial sector, precisely because it will allow whatever it is that we end up doing as a public policy community to be as tailored to the challenge as it can be. You can't do that narrow tailoring without data and without analytical support. Given the scope and nature of this problem, they should not be surprised that they would be more likely to get blunderbuss answers they won't like if they continue to oppose doing anything about this. So I would urge them to think through whether or not, in fact, better data and better analysis of this is actually a good thing from everyone's perspective.
You are at a think tank, so that's kind of where we fall.
I mean, if I had someone regulating my sector, I'd want that person to have a scalpel and not a sledgehammer, right? So.
I'd like to turn to audience questions now. And please, for those watching from online, please send them in. I can read them off of this tablet next to me. Why don't we go back here?
Hi, thank you so much for sharing your views today. So my name is Jia. I'm a research associate from the Asia Society Policy Institute. And this question is quite especially for Derek, because you mentioned about Yellen's pro-China stand. And there's also news that she's going to visit China soon this year. So I wonder what's your view on what kind of policies that she will communicate to the Chinese side, and what are your judgments? And also, what do you think she should have done or should do in the coming months. And welcome other comments from other speakers. Thank you.
Okay, I'll try to keep mine short. There is a Biden administration line of thinking, which I think is justified, which is we don't understand what Xi Jinping actually hears about the world. He has purged so many people around him and replaced them with loyalists that we don't know whether he's telling them anything realistic, he's being told anything realistic or not. And so we need to communicate intensely with Xi Jinping as closely as to get him as we can, repeat ourselves over and over again so the message is unmistakable. I think that's reasonable. I don't think Secretary Yellen would stop there. Secretary Yellen has a view of China as very important to global financial stability, and she's had it for a long time. And it's a view of China as a sense of an indispensable partner, which I think is wrong. I think it's at best outdated. It refers back to an earlier time before Xi Jinping became General Secretary, but otherwise it just could be completely wrong. I think she will try, Treasury is not representing itself as just trying to keep lines of communication open. They say that, but they also represent themselves on cooperation, on improved ties. It's very much, I think somebody mentioned it earlier, it's very much like we've gone back in the past and learned no lessons. Like it's 2007 or something like that. And so we're not going to get a change from Secretary Yellen. She will not be, regardless of who wins the election, she won't be Secretary of the Treasury next year. I don't think she wants to be. What I would like from the next Secretary of the Treasury is don't be Janet Yellen or Steve Mnuchin. Try to understand that China is a declining financial opportunity that allows you to consider the broader interests of the United States. And remember that when we talk about cooperating with China for global public goods, we have an example, a horrible example in 2020 of what happens when you rely on China to cooperate for global public goods.
Anyone want to?
If I might, there's a little bit of a game that Beijing has been playing too, where there are all kinds of issues on which the Biden administration has been trying to talk to Chinese counterparts. And on the whole, when it comes to issues of security and broader policy and strategy, they've tended to stiff arm the Americans. But this has sort of allowed them to cherry pick who their interlocutors are. And they've ended up where it's Janet, you try it. And the Chinese oh yeah, we'll talk to her. You're sort of playing to their strong suit here by allowing them to choose who the representatives of the USG are in dealing with these sort of massive, public policy issues. We should be careful of playing too much to their hand.
Let's go over here, and then we'll come to you.
My name is Roger Cochetti. I'm an editorial contributor on technology policy to the Hill newspaper, and in previous incarnations with ComSat, IBM, and VeriSign had reason to think about the issues of investments in China. And I have two questions that are closely linked. The first has to do with the effectiveness of sanctions on portfolio. They both have to do with portfolio investments, because direct investment is much more subject to regulation. Portfolio investment raises whole different questions. One British money manager explained to me that evading the restrictions on portfolio investment is simply a business expense for us. If the IRS hires 1,000 lawyers and accountants to track down everything, we will hire 3,000 lawyers and accountants to create new shell companies, to use new ways of cryptocurrency, and to find new investment havens. If they hire 10,000, so all that means is instead of offering the investor 16% return on equity, we'll offer them 15.7% return on equity. It's a business expense. There is no way that portfolio investments can be controlled in the modern world. The second issue that he raised, that I'd be interested, no one really addressed this, and he estimated that American investment represents somewhere between 20 and maximum 30% of global investment. So that if the United States were to prevent portfolio investment, we're able to do it. What that means is that the Swiss, the Dutch, the Japanese, the investors from other countries would cheer because, as he put it, the United States has decided it's going to hold its breath until it faints, because other countries would simply provide the investments that American portfolio investors are prohibited from. So the two questions are, number one, is it actually the case, could it ever be effective in the modern world with cryptocurrency and endless shell companies to be effective in stopping American portfolio investment in China? And number two, if it is, doesn't that simply open the doors to non-American investors? They get the 16%, and we have to make do with 12% because we don't invest in China. So two questions. Thank you.
So the first point, and it's been made to me before, I'm certainly not blaming you or even this British investor who I don't like, even though I've never met him, is nonsense. It's just utter nonsense. If you criminalize evasion of US regulations, it's not just a business cost. And that is extremely easy to write those regulations. Again, we don't want to criminalize a mistake, but the exact behavior that's being described is a criminal activity in a world where we have the proper regulatory authority. So that's just something that the financial sector says, like, oh, it would never work on us. I'm like, I can tell you the threat right now that will make you want to quit your job, much less try to evade US law. So that's nonsense. The second point is much better. I would say that there's a moral issue here, which is everyone else is doing it in creating surveillance technology and helping advance Chinese genetic, modifications. I don't think that means we should do it, but we should go beyond the moral. There was the period of time, I keep harping on this, but that's because that's when the money flow occurred. In 2017, 2019, 2020, American portfolio investment into China, as best I can tell, which is not ideal, was predominant among foreign portfolio flow. It wasn't predominant in other years, just those years. So we have the potential where there are times where US investment flow is really important and we don't want it to be available. There are other times when it's not. So that's a partial answer. The other partial answer, which I know everybody here is aware of, which is we have to lead on these things. No one else is going to. So if you want to coordinate with the Japanese or the Dutch or the Germans or whoever, we have to go first. You saw that to some extent on inbound investment, I think we're aware of, that once we had regulations out there, once we showed our commitment, people started saying, oh, okay, well, one, you're committed, and two, good, you've given us a template to work off of. It's not going to happen if we sit around and talk. That is very much a treasury idea, like, hey, let's make sure everyone's on the same page before we do anything, because parenthetically, we'll make sure everyone is never on the same page. There is a diminished effect of US controls when they're in isolation. Not nothing, but it's diminished. The only way we're going to get rid of that diminished effect is to step forward and lead.
Well, I know by analogy to the national security export controls arena that it's essentially impossible to convince someone else to take a strong position on, say, something like advanced hot section engine technology to China, unless you were willing to show that you're willing to do this too, right? I can't go to Rolls-Royce and say, hey, by the way, supporting this Chinese aerospace project is a terrible idea. Can you please not export your engines? What they're going to hear is like, oh yeah, Chris wants to make opportunities for GE or something, right? So you got to sort of be willing to jump in here. So I take that point very much, and the moral point is also not a bad one, although the availability argument is challenging to be sure. But I remember a comment by a guy named Gary Milholland, who used to run something called the Wisconsin Project on, I think it was on nuclear nonproliferation or something like that. But he had this line. He would be talking about export controls of widgets and technology, and he said, like, we cannot possibly fail to care if the guts of a missile falling on U.S. troops happen to say made in the United States, right? So at some point, yeah, it does actually matter. And if you're talking about, if you really care enough about this issue, totally willing to go first, totally willing to take at least a little bit of an availability hit, especially because that's in large part the ticket to help catalyze genuine cooperative engagement. If we had not been restricting semiconductors to Huawei the way that we were in 2019 and 2020, we couldn't have gotten the Dutch to go along and establish a national security export control policy for extreme ultraviolet lithography chip etching, for example. By analogy, there's probably something to be said for that in the investment field as well.
I'll jump in on the portfolio investment question particularly. I think it's demonstrably false because of what we did. and I led the process on Executive Order 13959, and it dropped, for example, China Mobile from American stock exchanges, which meant that stock dropped from who knows how many people's passive investors, which is where all the money is, as you know, right? Passive individual investors, all the institutional investors, that got dropped from all those indexes, all those funds. So to say that you can't stop it is again, demonstrably false. Now, can you find ways around that if you really wanted to? I agree with you. Yeah, I can go through other countries if I really, really want to invest in that particular stock. But man, I think most of the investors were very passive. And then on the foreign availability question, I think we need to, I'm much more convinced about foreign availability argument when it comes to trade, as Chris was talking about, export controls and things like that. I think with capital flows, from a USG policymaker perspective, having done that, and all of us having done that, I guess, it's actually good for America to encourage investment here. Like, okay, maybe a U.S. private investor could have got 16%, like you said, in China, but you know what? If I dissuaded that and disincentivized that, and he can get 15% here in America, that's good for our country, and that's okay with me.
I don't have much more to add because that was excellent, and I completely agree with everything that's been said. But I just want to observe also that this is about the United States' national interest. We do plenty of things all the time that other countries don't do, which might disadvantage an importer in the United States relative to an importer in the EU or what have you. But we do them either because of American values or the American national interest. And we see a plethora of examples about this. Huawei's been mentioned. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act has also been mentioned. In each of these cases, we generally see that United States action is required to spark broader change, as the panelists have discussed. So I think that it's a completely normal state of affairs.
Sorry, you've been waiting very patiently. Could we? Right here. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jack Fisher. I'm an intern for the government relations team here at AAI. And my question is regarding the muck that gets created to kind of cloak the circumstances or even the lack of action from the government on China. Can you outline some of the incentives, whether they're anecdotal or from what's been able to have been ascertained so far? What are some of the incentives that prevent such action?
There are costs, right? I mean, people say there's a bipartisan consensus on China, which I say there's a bipartisan consensus on China to talk and do nothing. Because if you do something, there's a cost. So the ratio of speech to action is extremely high. Because the speech not only costs you nothing, it might convince people that you really are protecting American interests in this case. But all of these things have costs. I mean, this is a very simple point, but it's a good thing to bring up. I don't think anybody here, maybe I'm the most hawkish on this issue, but if someone else is the most hawkish, none of us say, oh, there's no cost. It's magic. Magic will happen. This is one of the reasons I don't like former President Trump's view of tariffs. Like it's magic. No, it's not magic. First of all, your 25% tariff didn't do very much. I mean, 60% tariff would do something. It would also have a cost. So, politicians, all of them, Democrats, Republicans, conservatives, liberals, all want to propose something and pretend there's no cost. But when the rubber hits the road, we're not sanctioning Bolivia. No offense to Bolivia, just picking out a nice small country. That's all. We're not sanctioning Bolivia, so people will notice. And that's basically it. This is cheap language that, when I started calling for decoupling 10 years ago, no one picked up on it. And now it's very popular to sound tough on China. But then someone will come into your office and say, this is going to cost my business in your district, in your state. And we have to do what Bryan's been saying over and over again and put the national interest ahead of those costs. But that's not fun. What's fun is making the speech. I was a little cynical, sorry.
Anyone? Anyone else? Are there any other questions from the audience?
If I could just add a quick footnote on that last comment too. This goes back to data with which Derek led, right? I mean, if the concern is to have maximum impact and minimum cost, which is a pretty reasonable aspiration, whether you can get there in the real world or not is a different question. But if that's what you want to do, how do you do it? You need to be able to make your decisions on the basis of actual information with decision support and analytical models and the kind of input to the decision-making process that would sort of make you proud to be making a high-stakes, high-impact decision on the basis of that information. So you can't even have a discussion about how to minimize cost, I would say, unless you do better about collecting information about what the problem looks like in the first place. And the willful blindness to the nature and scope of this problem is in some respect the most scandalous piece of the entire episode, because all of these questions are legit questions, and the answers may be very challenging and hard, and there'll be equities that need to be balanced and compromises that need to be made. Sure, I worked on the Hill for 10 years, I understand sausage making. But you can't even have that discussion in an intelligible way if you're deliberately unwilling to collect information about the scope, nature, and extent of the problem. That is a disgrace, frankly.
I just have to riff on that because Chris is like talking about analytical models and all that, and I love that stuff, right? But I mean, I would like to know the amount of U.S. investment in Chinese quantum computing in 2020 and 2023. That's not an analytical model, it's 2 data points, right? And it would really help, right? Did it rise? Oh no, what should we do? Did it collapse? Well, that's not a high priority sector right now. Maybe it will be in the future. So like, the problem is so basic that we, even there's one silver lining, I guess. Even a small step forward would really help us a lot because we know so little.
Okay, the one thing I'll add to this is that cost, it's more about shifting the cost to somebody else. It's not really that like there are costs to be incurred, and I think it's just more the institutional resistance to change. It is much more the factor, and because even if there's a compliance cost, there's some law firm here that gains from that. I mean, there just is, right? So the cost is being shifted, and I'll tell you, Derek and I obviously disagree on some things. One of them is, the tariffs, the 25% tariffs, and from a geopolitical aspect, and I was, Asia policy, the Trump tariffs have done what we only dreamed that TPP would do. Okay, we used to import 22% of our goods before the tariffs came on from China. Now we're down, I think, below 14%. And where did it all go? Southeast Asia, Taiwan, all the other countries that, that's what we wanted. And I don't think TPP would have moved it that fast even. So the costs have shifted, they've changed, but there are gains. That means some people gain, and it's a question of people fighting those changes.
Stay tuned because Ivan and I will be here for the next hour and a half arguing about the tariffs. But that's not really the topic, so I'll leave it at that.
We have time for one quick question.
Hi, thank you. I'm Kieran from the British Embassy in Washington, and I promise it is a quick question. On Bryan, I'd be interested to hear from others on timelines for like the EO and potential congressional action. We know that the draft regulations from the administration should be coming in months. Yes, chuckle. But do you think it's in House leadership's interest, or do you think that they will be trying to find a compromise before that next stage? Or is it their interest to wait until the draft regs are published to try to get their factions moving to a compromise?
That's a good question. I don't know. I don't have any special insight into that. I think as somebody who cares about this, I hope that there will be expeditious movement regardless. What we saw last summer and really throughout the entire course of last year is that moving on this particular issue is something that the White House is incredibly willing to delay based on other goals vis-a-vis China, based on whatever sort of meeting is on the docket for the next month or the next 3 months or the next quarter. So I think that it's likely to see timelines substantially shift. This is just one part of a larger sort of national security meltdown that's happening in Congress. So part of the dynamic is going to be when certain things are moving and when vehicles happen. If we have a situation where both chambers are trying to complete the defense bill earlier than normal due to the election calendar, then maybe we'll see the House sort of accelerate in advance of the administration. But I think it's not quite early enough to say with any degree of certainty. I'm not sure if anybody else has
I mean, I had a conversation with House leadership about this. It was several months ago. It could have been wildly overtaken by events. All I'll say about the conversation is they were very aware that the longer you wait to do something on China, even if the Senate won't take it up or the president says I'm not signing it or whatever it is, the worse you look. It doesn't have to be on outbound investment. But I think several people have mentioned that Republicans controlled the House in 2023. And what came out on China? Anyone? So there is a pressure not to be waiting for the administration, as Bryan just said. You could be waiting until the transition to the next administration, whoever it is, to get those regulations. Or they could pop up in September as a political move. So I think House leadership is aware that they should move as quickly as possible. Now, why that hasn't happened, Bryan discussed in his presentation. So being aware of it and doing it are two very different things. But I do think there's an awareness.
Yeah, I think like the national security embarrassment for conservative leaders is like a standing pressure that will continue to be the case until movement happens.
Well, that takes us to the end of our time. I want to thank the panelists and the audience for a discussion that went from the high altitude to the granular with a little bit of heat and much light. So thank you all for coming today.
Thanks, Charles. Really glad.